The Punic Wars are one of the most important clashes between civilizations in history, and their outcome was undoubtedly decisive in shaping the world as we know it today. They constituted a key moment in which the two major powers of the Mediterranean clashed for control, with battles of proportions hardly known before. According to legend, Rome was founded on April 21st, 753 BC. Carthage is older, as it is said to have been founded by Dido, a semi-legendary Phoenician princess, a few years after the Trojan War, thus in the 12th century BC. Although the Romans considered 814 as the year of birth of their main enemy city. Dido was the daughter of Tyre. Her brother, Pygmalion, forced her to marry Sychaeus and subsequently murdered him. It was revealed to Dido in a dream that her brother had committed the crime, so she escaped. Arriving at the present Gulf of Tunis, she met Larbus, king of the Gaetuli. Dido asks to give them as much land as she could surround them with a bull skin. They laughingly agree, thinking she will get nothing. Dido cuts the skin into very thin strips and manages to cover a large amount of land, on which she founds Carthage. Years later, the son of Venus Aeneas arrives there, who, after fleeing from the fall of Troy, was looking for a place to found a new city. He becomes Dido's lover, but abandons her by order of Jupiter, who had reserved for him the creation of the lineage that would give rise to Rome. Dido, dejected, commits suicide. This is the mythical explanation given by the Romans to the visceral hatred between the two peoples. With the passage of time, the city of Carthage came to dominate the northwest African coast, southern Iberia, the Balearic Islands, Corsica, Sardinia, and western Sicily, favored by its central position on the Mediterranean sea lanes. By the 3rd century, Rome was also a power, having conquered a large part of the Italian peninsula thanks to its victories against the Latins, the Samnites, and the Greek king Pyrrhus. The two republics had traditionally had good relations. In fact, they had allied against the invasion of Pyrrhus, but their desire for expansion is about to collide for the first time. In 288 BC, the Mamertines, a group of mercenaries, find themselves out of work in Sicily and decide to conquer the city of Messina, which allows them to control the strait between Italy and Sicily. Syracuse, ruled by the tyrant Hiram II, besieges them. The Mamertines ask for help from both Rome and Carthage. The first to respond was Carthage, which already controlled a large part of the island and quickly succeeded in making the Syracusans retreat. The Mamertines still want to ally with Rome, but the Romans hesitate. The Senate discusses at length the entry into Sicily. On the one hand, there were those who believed that entering Sicily would mean war against Carthage, and that this would be detrimental to Rome, as well as being in breach of the treaty signed with Carthage in 278, whereby Rome would not enter Sicily and Carthage would not enter Italy. On the other hand, others believed that not acting against the Carthaginians would be dangerous, since they only had Syracuse left to control all of Sicily, and then their next step could be to enter Italy. The Senate passes the decision to the popular assembly, which ends up deciding in favor of war against Carthage, thinking that it would bring wealth to the city and a large amount of grain, the main product of Sicily. In 264 BC, Rome starts the First Punic War with an expedition to expel the Carthaginians and the Syracusans from Messina. Subsequently, it besieged Syracuse, initially allied with Carthage, until the tyrant Hiram II decided to change sides. The Carthaginians retreat to Agrigento, the main Punic city on the island. Rome besieged it with 40,000 legionnaires, distributed in 4 legions and 2,000 knights. The city was well walled, and the Romans, who had the logistical support of Syracuse, had no siege technology to take the city, so the only way was to surround the city and wait for its surrender by starvation. To help the Agrigentines and the garrison of the city, about 1,500 men, arrived a few months later a Punic army formed by about 50,000 soldiers and 6,000 horsemen commanded by Hannon. In addition, it had about 60 African forest elephants. They are smaller than other elephant breeds but reach 2.5 meters in height. The Romans had met them some years before in the wars against Pyrrhus when they did not even know their name and called them Lucanian oxen. Both sides fought in the open field until the Romans won, although many Carthaginians escaped. Finally, after 7 months of siege, the Romans managed to take the city, and the inhabitants of the city were enslaved. However, the most important part of the war will be fought at sea. Carthage was a maritime power, but Rome had to build a fleet practically from scratch, since so far all its conquests had been made by land. At this point, military intelligence was key, since for the construction of their new fleet, they were inspired by the ships captured from the Punics after the capture of Agrigento. The most commonly used boat was the quinquereme, with 5 rows of oars, and to a lesser extent the trireme. An important role was played by the use of the corvus, crow, a boarding system already used by the Greeks, which, according to the historian Polybius, was mounted on the ships and consisted of a gangway movable with a pulley, 1.2 meters wide and 10.9 meters long, with hooks at the extremities. A pulley made this device descend on the enemy ships, allowing the soldiers to board. This is how the Romans achieved their first naval victory at the Battle of Mylae, today's Milazzo, just after being defeated at the Lipari Islands. This ingenuity initially surprised the Punics a lot, but it made the ships heavier and less manageable, which contributed to the destruction of many ships during at least 3 storms, and to their use being abandoned after the First Punic War. In the following years, they alternate victories in various land and naval battles, including some clashes on the islands of Sardinia and Corsica. The Carthaginian soldiers, after being defeated at Sulci, crucify their admiral Hannibal Gisco. The Romans launch a new offensive under the command of Marcus Atilius Regulus, who wants to move the war to Africa. He defeats in the naval battle of Cape Ecnomo the Carthaginians, whose generals were Hamilcar and Hanno. He then captures or convinces 200 African cities to change sides, and Carthage even asks for peace, but does not accept because they consider the conditions offered too harmful. The Carthaginians had asked the Lacedaemonians, or Spartans, for a mercenary general. Xanthippus, in English Xanthippus, arrives, who soon proves his worth and defeats Attalus by capturing most his entire army, including him. The war continues in Sicily, where the Romans, after rebuilding their fleet, win at Palermo. General Asdrubal succeeds in reconquering Agrigento and a large part of Sicily from the Carthaginians. For a few years, there were no decisive advances. The Punics send an embassy to Rome to negotiate bringing Attalus with them. Attalus himself urges the Romans not to negotiate and returns to Carthage, even though he knows it will mean his death. After a storm, Rome has to rebuild its fleet again. This time it is privately financed by a few prominent citizens, as the state was without funds. The final battle that decides the war takes place in 241 BC on the Aegates Islands. The Romans were trying to block Carthaginian supplies to the west of the island. The Carthaginian fleet spotted them and, finding themselves downwind, attacked. To fight in these unfavorable conditions, the Romans decided to dismantle all the non-core elements of the ships, such as masts or sails. This was essential since the Punic ships were much heavier, as they were loaded with supplies, and the Latins were able to ram them better thanks to their lightness. About 250 ships of each side faced each other. The Carthaginians lost 10,000 men and were left with no more economic or military resources. They surrendered and signed the Peace of Lutatius, renouncing Sicily, which had become the first Roman province. Carthage also undertook to abandon all the islands between Africa and Italy and to pay important war reparations. The peace signed after the First Punic War had left Carthage in a difficult situation. It is obliged to pay tribute, but has less territory from which to draw resources. They ask their mercenaries to give up part of their salaries. This provokes revolts that are put down by the generals Hamilcar and Hannon. Another rebellion of mercenaries seizes Sardinia from the Carthaginians and asks Rome for protection, which sends an expedition to the island. Carthage protests, and Rome declares war. Without a fight, Carthage renounces Sardinia and has no choice but to cede Corsica and accept the payment of more tribute. This causes Carthage's desire for revenge to grow. The Carthaginian Republic focuses its expansion in Hispania, rich in resources such as minerals and oil. In 237 BC, Hamilcar disembarked in what is now Cadiz and for years extended his dominions. After the death of Hamilcar, his son-in-law Asdrubal takes over. He founds Carthage Nova and continues the expansion up to the Ebro River. Rome sends an embassy demanding not to cross it. They accept. When Asdrubal dies, Hannibal, son of Hamilcar, proclaims himself leader of the army. As a young man, he had sworn eternal hatred for Rome. Already as general, Hannibal consolidates the lands to the south of the Ebro, attacking the last important independent city, Sagunto, 170 kilometers to the south of the Ebro. They ask Rome, their ally, for help. Rome demands Carthage not to attack it, but it does, since it does not violate the agreement that fixes the Ebro as a limit. After 8 months of siege, Sagunto falls. Rome does not intervene, but sends a delegation with an ultimatum. Either they surrender Hannibal or war. War. Hannibal's plan is to take the fight to Italy. In 218, he crosses the Ebro with some 80,000 infantry, 10,000 cavalry, and 37 elephants. He crosses the Pyrenees and Alps unopposed and reaches the Po River, defeating or uniting to his cause the Gallic tribes he encounters. In the Ticino and Trebia rivers, he defeats the Romans, which makes him add more Gauls, already a majority in his army. He continued south and had to cross some marshes. At this point, there was only one elephant left in the army, on which Hannibal rode, who had lost an eye, probably due to an infection. While the consul Flaminius was moving his army along the shore of Lake Trasimene, he was ambushed. It is a slaughter in which 15,000 Romans die. The Senate, alarmed, appoints a dictator for 6 months, Quintus Fabius Maximus, nicknamed the Timer, for following a defensive strategy, avoiding direct fighting. The Romans prevail in the Tyrrhenian Sea, preventing Hannibal to reinforce and also cross the Ebro. Hannibal has a clear road to Rome, less than 150 kilometers from the Trasimeno. However, he heads east and besieges the city of Spoletium without success, so he continues south. He occupies Cannae, a city with large grain reserves. There he leads an unprecedented Roman army with 8 legions, which, according to Polybius, doubles in number to the Punic, but suffers a disaster. 6,000 Carthaginians and 70,000 Romans die out of a total army of 80,000. This is how Valerius Maximus describes the situation. The disaster of Cannae plunged our city into such tremendous confusion that Marcus Junius Pera, being at the head of the Republic as dictator, the weapons of the enemies, which remained nailed to the temples as an offering to the gods, were taken away to be used in the imminent battle. Children who were not yet citizens took up arms, and even 6,000 soldiers were enlisted, among debt slaves and those condemned for capital crimes. Hannibal's cruelty, perhaps exaggerated, increased the terror among the Romans. Hannibal, whose courage lay mainly in his cruelty, crossed his troops across the river Bargello by building a bridge made of Roman corpses so that the land would experience the fateful advance of the Carthaginian infantry as Neptune had previously experienced that of his fleet. Hannibal himself was leaving behind Roman prisoners who were exhausted by the burden and the road, but not before cutting off their toes. Those whom he had taken with him to his camp he ordered by pairs of brothers or relatives and forced them to fight with the sword, and he did not get enough of blood until from all of them came out a single victor. The situation was desperate. The Romans themselves saw this moment as a clash between two opposing universes in which the hegemony of the known world was at stake, as shown by this speech of the consul Gaius Terentius Veron, quoted by Livy, in which he tries to convince the rulers of Capua to help him. "What is left for us after Canis? Fortune has left us nothing. Infantry, cavalry, arms, ensigns, horses, and men, money, provisions, perished at the battlefront or the next day when the two camps were lost. The Carthaginian, our enemy, brings with him soldiers from the farthest ends of the earth, from the straits of the Atlantic and the pillars of Hercules, not even natives of Africa, who know absolutely neither law nor condition nor almost human speech. To these, rough and savage by nature and by custom, their own chief made them even more ferocious, building bridges and dams by piling up human corpses and teaching them to feed, one feels ashamed even to say it, on human flesh. Who that was born in Italy would not find it odious to see and have as masters those who have fed on these horrible delicacies, that it is sacrilege even to touch them, and to receive laws from Carthage, from Africa, and to consent that Italy should be a province of the Numidians and of the Mars. However, Capua, second city of the Italic Peninsula, allies with Hannibal with the desire to take revenge for the Roman conquest. It is Hannibal's finest hour. The Carthaginian Senate, despite the opposition of the aristocratic faction of Hannan against Hannibal, sends reinforcements to Italy. Fabius Maximus is re-elected consul, and the war of attrition is resumed. The Carthaginians take Tarentum and ally with Syracuse in Macedonia. Fighting continues in Hispania, Sardinia, Campania, and Sicily without significant advances until Rome takes Syracuse. In 211, Hannibal marches by surprise towards Rome. He establishes his camp 3 miles away, and his cavalry arrives next to the gates. According to Livy's account, the Numidian horsemen who had gone over to the Roman side had to cross the city to get faster to the place where the Carthaginians were approaching, unleashing chaos. When some saw them galloping down from the citadel and the capital, they began to shout that the Aventine was taken. This caused such confusion and such running that the terrified crowd would have rushed en masse to the outside of the city had not the Carthaginian camp been there. They sought refuge in the houses and attacked their own with stones and throwing objects, taking them for enemies as they crossed the streets. It was not possible to stop the tumult and undo the misunderstanding because the roads were crowded with peasants and cattle dragged en masse towards the city by the sudden alarm. The cavalry combat was favorable, and the enemies were repulsed. The next day, Hannibal crossed the river Anio and formed his troops in battle order. The consuls did not refuse the combat. When both armies were prepared for the fate of the battle in which the victor's trophy would be the city of Rome, a torrential rain mixed with hail caused such confusion in both formations that they retired to the camps almost unable to hold their arms, with as much fear as they had of the enemy. Also, the next day, a similar squall separated the contenders, lined up in the same place. As soon as they took refuge in the camps, the atmosphere became serene with a surprising calm. The Carthaginians attributed a religious significance to this circumstance, and they say that Hannibal was heard to say that sometimes he lacked the will and sometimes the luck to seize the city of Rome. It is one of those moments that could have changed the course of history, and it remains one of the greatest enigmas why Hannibal did not attack Rome. The city had hardly any soldiers to defend it, but Hannibal decided to move away to the south. Perhaps the cause was religious, or perhaps the walls seemed impregnable, considering that he had not been able to besiege Spoletium shortly before. Shortly thereafter, Syphax, king of western Numidia, until then a vassal state of the Carthaginians, rebelled against them, and they had to send troops to control him. Scipio, later called the African, takes command and in 209 conquers Carthage Nova, the main Punic city in Iberia. Carthage sends reinforcements to Italy by land, but the Romans stop them. In 206, Scipio wins in Ilipa, making the end of the conflict in Hispania. The struggle moves to the sea. The Punic fleet suffers several defeats that are practically its end. Scipio lands in Africa, Syphax now supports the Carthaginians, and Massinissa, king of the other great Numidian tribe, supports the Romans. Rome subdues some cities, and Carthage signs a treaty whereby Hannibal has to leave Italy and Carthage gives up its possessions outside Africa. However, when Hannibal returns from Italy, he breaks the armistice. The decisive battle takes place at Zama near Carthage in 202. The Romans win and impose an even harsher treaty than that of the First Punic War, with heavy tribute and a ban on declaring war without permission. Hannibal himself negotiates this peace. He then promotes a law whereby the oligarchs must pay the tribute. The aristocratic faction accuses him of having contacts with Antiochus III, king of the Seleucid Empire, and Rome demands his surrender. Hannibal goes into exile and tries to help Antiochus III in a war against Rome, but ends up having to commit suicide. As a result of the Second Punic War, Rome is the great power of the Mediterranean. In the peace treaty that put an end to the Second Punic War, important indemnities were fixed for the Carthaginians. However, Carthage had definitively lost its possessions in the Iberian Peninsula, a great source of resources for them, so it was very difficult for them to collect the 200 talents of silver per year that they had to pay as tribute for 50 years after the war. Moreover, by imposition of the treaty, Carthage could not declare war without the permission of Rome, but had to militarily assist the Roman Republic in its wars against Antiochus III, king of the Seleucid Empire, and Philip V and Perseus, kings of Macedonia, deepening its economic problems. At the same time, the traumas of the struggle are still very present in Rome, unable to forget the great amount of human and other losses caused by the invasion of Italy, as well as the terror provoked by the proximity of Hannibal, for centuries remembered and used by Roman mothers as a way to frighten children. Massinissa, king of Numidia and ally of Rome, took advantage of the defenselessness of Carthage to take 2 cities from them, using as an excuse the myth of the foundation of Carthage, which said that they descended from a foreigner, Dido, who had only obtained the right to have as much land as she could cover with an ox skin. Both times Rome denied Carthage the right to defend itself. There was a third time, and in about 152 BC, Massinissa conquered the Punic city of Oroscopa. A Roman embassy traveled to Carthage, outraged by the loss of territory and wealth. Among the Roman delegates who were to act as arbitrators in the problems between the Carthaginians and the Numidians was Cato the Elder, the most prominent supporter of the final annihilation of Carthage. During his visit, Cato the Elder was surprised by the prosperity of the Carthaginian capital, despite the sanctions of war. He returns home aware of the importance of definitively destroying Carthage. Plutarch says that he provoked the war. When Cato found the city not devastated or in a miserable situation, as the Romans believed, but overflowing with brave young men full of enormous wealth, full of weapons of all kinds, and war material that showed proudly, he thought that for the Romans, it was not the time to establish and deal with the problems of the Numidians and Massinissa. He believed that, if they did not seize the city, an old enemy that had prospered in an incredible way full of rancor, they would run again the same dangers. He therefore hurried back and informed the Senate that the previous defeats and misfortunes of the Carthaginians, having less undermined their power than their folly, seemed to transform them not weaker, but more trained to war, and that already the combats against the Numidians preluded those which they would make against the Romans, and that peace and pacts were a name for the delay of the war which awaited their occasion. Plutarch adds that, in making known his opinion on any matter, he would add to what he said the following: "It seems to me good that Carthage does not exist." Historians disagree about the exact phrase, which is passed into the popular imagination as "Carthage must be destroyed," in Latin, "Carthago delenda est." It was the third time that Rome prevented Carthage from defending itself, so they decided to break the peace treaty. The 50 years of tribute payments imposed by the treaty had already passed, so they considered the rest of the terms of the agreement invalid. In 150 BC, they prepared an army of some 30,000 soldiers and attempted to reconquer Oroscopa, but suffered an unmitigated defeat. The pact is broken. The Carthaginian state is divided between those who hate the Romans and want war, and the pre-Romans who want to live in peace. The latter expelled to death the leaders of the military faction, including Hannibal the Boeotarch, the general who had tried to conquer Oroscopa. They try to negotiate with Rome so as not to start another war, but they do not succeed, and in 149 BC, the Third Punic War begins. Carthage declares its unconditional surrender and hands over 300 young Carthaginians as hostages. However, Rome deploys 80,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry in Africa and demands the surrender of all weapons. After initial reluctance, the Carthaginians delivered armaments for some 200,000 soldiers and 2,000 catapults. In addition, the Romans burned the Punic military ships. With Carthage disarmed, the Roman delegate speaks thus according to Appianus: "We praise you, Carthaginians, for your promptness in obeying and your present zeal in the matter of hostages and arms. However, one should not speak too much in decisive circumstances. Accept with nobility the remaining orders of the Senate. Renounce Carthage in our favor, and settle wherever you wish within your territory at least 80 stadia, about 15 kilometers, from the sea. For we have decided to raise your city to the ground." With this request, Rome wanted to take away Carthage's main source of wealth, maritime trade. Moreover, by destroying the city, they wanted to prevent the Numidians from taking it, for in that case they might become too powerful a force, only 3 days' sail from Rome. The anger in Carthage was such that the people almost murdered the ambassadors. Seeing war inevitable, they began to rearm. Some of the measures they took were to assassinate all the Italics, free the slaves to help in the defense of the city, call back Asdrubal the Boeotarch to lead the army, reinforce the walls, and ask for a 30-day truce to send a delegation to Rome. The Carthaginians had to make new weapons, and they melted down any metal they could find to do so, and even used female hair to make bows. Soon after, the Romans tried to conquer the city, which had some 90,000 defenders, in addition to 300,000 civilians. In various battles, the Carthaginians managed to successfully defend themselves against Roman attempts to penetrate the excellently equipped and defended walls. The following year, the 2 Roman consuls were also unable to enter the Punic capital and were even defeated in other minor cities. After the winter in 147 BC, Scipio Aemilianus was elected consul. He had already excelled in the attempts to take Carthage and now finally has the power of command. He decides to focus on taking the capital. He blocks its port by building a dike and mounts the siege. Gradually, his strategy succeeds, and he manages to isolate the city, prey to famine and an epidemic. After the winter, the Romans launched the final attack, taking advantage of the Punic weakness. Even so, the city must be conquered street by street, house by house, for 23 days. Scipio promises to pardon all those who surrender. Among them is the leader Asdrubal. Appianus relates that he addressed Scipio thus: "There is no reason for vengeance against you from the gods, Roman, since you have followed the laws of war. But with regard to that Asdrubal who has become a traitor to his homeland, to his temples, to me and to my sons, may the gods take their revenge, and you along with them." On the other hand, to Asdrubal he said, "O thou most wretched, traitorous, and effeminate among men, me and my sons shall this fire bury, but thou, the leader of the great Carthage, to what triumph wilt thou serve as an ornament? What punishment wilt thou receive from him at whose feet thou standest?" After hurling these reproaches, he cut the throats of his sons and threw himself with them into the fire. Thus the end of Carthage brings to mind its legendary queen Dido, who had committed suicide and burned herself on a funeral pyre after the flight of Aeneas. After 3 years, Carthage has fallen. The city is sacked, and the Senate decides that it should be destroyed to the ground. Legend has it that the city was covered with salt, but no ancient source mentions this, and the amount of salt that would have been needed makes the act very expensive and unfeasible. The survivors were sold as slaves, and the territories, already in the hands of Roman or African colonists, formed the province of Africa. Carthage would be rebuilt a century later by Julius Caesar. Also in 146, Rome destroyed Corinth, which represented the domination of Greece. With no strong rivals on the horizon, Rome was already caput mundi, head of the known world. However, the future of the city would be turbulent. 4 civil wars, coup d'etat, dictatorships. The historian Sallust attributes this to the year in which Rome dominated the Mediterranean and lost its fear of the enemy, causing a weakening and relaxation that ended up being detrimental. That's it for today, but don't worry, we're just getting started. Thanks for joining this historical ride, and get ready for more fun facts and stories in the next video. See you soon, time travelers.